In 1884, Burma, now known as Myanmar, teetered on the edge of chaos, caught between the colonial ambitions of two superpowers, the British Empire and France. Enter Warnford White, a daring English provocateur, the 19th century's precursor to Jason Bourne, with a knack for igniting geopolitical powder kegs. His weapon of choice? A bold gambit designed to force Britain into action. What follows is a whirlwind of treachery, diplomacy, and a high-stakes confrontation with the volatile Middle Queen, Supayalat, the last Queen of Burma. Her fiery temper and unpredictable wrath spark a chain reaction of escalating tensions, narrow escapes, and imperial maneuvering, all culminating in the thunderous arrival of British troops and the fall of Burma as an independent kingdom. This is espionage, wit, and the ruthless chessboard of empires, woven into a tale so extraordinary it just might be true. Bug-Eyed Tales presents The Queen's Temper, as told by Warnford White and set down by MUONG SHWAY.
Concerning this remarkable narrative, the author, who prefers to be known by his Burmese nickname, writes as follows. Anyone intimate with Upper Burma between 1885 and 1894 will remember the mysterious White, who flitted about, apparently under a double personality, and who married a Japanese girl and disappeared. From his lips I heard the story, and it was on his authority. Who will say whether what happened in 1883 and 1884? Among a cloud of witnesses, one man has told the story upon oath, my friend White. Living on the spot, among people who knew both, and given the tale, backed by historical and documentary evidence, by the principal actor, I can neither prove nor disprove his statement. I, MUONG SHWAY, therefore set it down here, just as it was told to me. Although I had his word as to the Queen, had ample chances of checking his statements, and found nothing wrong with them. The question which concerns the student of history is, why did the cleverest woman in Asia destroy herself politically and lose 1 million in jewels at the same time, for the sake of gratifying a temporary outburst of rage against an obscure white man who had dared to tell her the unpalatable truth upon the very steps of her throne?
When the Irrawaddy Trading Company's paddle steamer stopped to take on coal at Shwechong, the captain had little reason to expect trouble, and that changed with the arrival of Mang Mien, a high-ranking noble of royal blood, flanked by a heavily armed detachment of the king's troops. No explanation was given as 3 Madrasi firemen were clubbed unconscious, the cargo seized, and the captain himself dragged off to the palace dungeons on the east side. A minor incident, perhaps, one of many that had already pushed Rangoon's merchants to the brink. But under the grim counsel of his war minister, the king issued a decree. For now, at least, the raids on British steamers would cease. The matter might have ended there, indefinitely buried in the volatile undercurrents of politics and trade, had it not been for what happened next. How the volume came into my possession is unimportant. What mattered was its contents. Photographs, schematics, and printed details outlining an ambitious scheme to establish a rail and steamer service to Mandalay. The proposal extolled the virtues of modern transport, painting it as a grand opportunity for Burma, promising efficiency, prosperity, and progress, provided, of course, that the contract was awarded to the right people. The right people, in this case, were a well-known French company. On the cover, embossed in an ornate gilded scroll entwined with a diamond lozenge-shaped design, were the words, "To His Majesty, the Emperor of Burma." A subtle gesture of respect, a blatant bid for influence, and, in the wrong hands, a dangerous piece of leverage. There is nothing in the world, short of outright conquest, that spells protectorate as convincingly as a well-managed railway. And while I have no quarrel with the French, it didn't take me long to realise I was far better suited to champion this railway scheme than the gentleman biding his time for the next upriver steamer to the so-called centre of the universe, where he intended to present himself and his treasured proposal to the Burmese government. With mango season in full swing and dysentery running rampant, No one found it particularly surprising when Monsieur fell violently ill. His sudden collapse and subsequent admission to the Rangoon hospital for a 3-week stay raised no eyebrows. It was, after all, an unfortunate but entirely natural coincidence. I wasn't there. By the time Monsieur was confined to his hospital bed, I was already on the move. Under cover of night, I slipped into the woods behind the Shway Dagon, the stolen volume tucked safely away. From there, I rode hard to the landing stage opposite Moulmein, where the next leg of my journey began. A week later, I stepped onto the Mandalay shore, unannounced, unnoticed, and exactly where I needed to be. An Englishman was a rarity in those parts, but I wasn't entirely without allies. Scattered among the city's tangled streets and back alleys were a few trusted acquaintances, enough to make my presence less conspicuous. I stepped off the boat without a second glance from the riverfront crowd, blending into the flow of dockworkers and traders. In one hand, I carried a battered Gladstone bag, in the other, a book wrapped carefully in oilskin, its contents far more dangerous than they appeared. No one stopped me, no one asked questions. I knew Mandalay. I knew its streets, its rhythms, and the silent undercurrents that ruled it. Wasting no time, I stepped from the river's edge and into a waiting horse-drawn gharry, the wheels rattling over the uneven roads as I made my way directly to the palace. As expected, the king remained secluded, still ailing, locked away in his private chambers, a shadow of his former self. But the real power, she was there, silent, unseen, and as formidable as ever. The middle queen, Supayalat, a woman whose whispers dictated the fate of a kingdom, a woman whose temper had already rewritten history in blood, and I was about to walk straight into her world. A gilded bedizened cart, drawn by 2 white bullocks, rolled past just as I finished speaking with the guards. From within, a familiar face emerged, a man I knew well, the king's masseur, cunning, influential, and for now, an ally. Neither of us reacted, not a flicker of recognition, not a glance too long. In Mandalay, caution was survival. 20 minutes later, I was seated cross-legged on his dinner mat, wolfing down food as he spoke in a low, measured voice, detached, almost indifferent. He told me what I already knew, the bloody tale of the accession. But then, he told me what I didn't. The latest state murders, executions so fresh the city still whispered their names. Before anyone reading these lines dares to brand me a traitor to the King of Burma, let me set the record straight. This was Mandalay, 1884, a city simmering with ambition, treachery, and the brutal calculations of power. At the heart of it all stood a woman like no other. Clever, fearless, and strikingly beautiful, she had risen, sudden and blinding, like a meteor over the east. Unlike most, she understood a truth too dangerous to speak aloud. With the right manoeuvring, any one of the 50 royal princes could seize the throne upon the king's death. She needed an ally, someone ruthless, with real power. She found him in the Minister of War, a man who also commanded the army, held the power of life and death over 20,000 troops, and knew exactly how to use it. Together they would reshape Burma, or burn it to the ground trying. The old war minister knew what was coming. A new king meant a short, unpleasant future for him, if he even had one. So he made his move. He threw in his lot with her. Together, they orchestrated a coup d'etat, placing Fibor, a young, well-mannered, utterly unremarkable prince, onto the Burmese throne. The city roared in protest, the palace even louder, but neither noise lasted long. The commander-in-chief made sure the bazaar understood that meddling in politics was lethal, while the woman, Supayalat, was crowned middle queen and, on the same day, elevated to a far more chilling title, Lady High Executioner. Well, then the palace doors slammed shut. The clearing began. Every man, woman, and child of royal blood was hunted down, seized, and locked in the cells. That night, the Queen ensured the king slept through it all. A carefully measured dose of opium saw to that. By morning, her first royal decree was ready. A death warrant for every claimant to the throne. Supayala had no patience for rivals. The executions were brutal, efficient, and absolute. The men were clubbed at the base of the skull, collapsing before they even knew they were dead. The women, tied tight across the throat, met the same fate. Their bodies, stripped of name and title, were carted to the Irrawaddy, where the current swallowed them whole. By the time it was over, nearly 100 people had been erased. I won't say the Queen was wrong. That's not my point. I only want to make one thing clear. I knew exactly the kind of woman I was dealing with. And when the time came, I acted accordingly. I sat in the dim glow of the fat lamp, the flickering light casting long shadows as old Kulard droned on, his voice a slow rhythmic murmur about queens, power, and the Supayala in particular. But I wasn't listening. Not really. I was racking my brain for a way in, a way to stand before the Queen without losing my head in the process, a way to force her hand, manipulate events and ignite the inevitable collision between my government and the Burmese throne. And yet, something gnawed at me. I liked Burma. Its people, its rhythms, its easy pleasures. A land that laughed more than it fought. And here I was, plotting its downfall, setting the stage for a war that would rip it from itself. I took another slow drag from my cheroot, staring into the flame. There was no turning back now. I spent the night at Kula's house, a modest but well-kept residence tucked away from prying eyes. Kula was an old hand in Mandalay, a man who knew things before others did. Merchant, fixer, informant, whatever you called him, he had a way of navigating power without getting crushed by it. And for now, he was an ally. By morning, we set off for the War Minister's quarters, just outside the palace walls. The bazaar was alive. A riot of colour, sound and scent, thousands of open-air shops, their owners hawking wares to a constant flow of chattering women, wide-eyed children and sharp-eyed traders. Temples and changs rose between the stalls, their gilded roofs glinting in the sun. Burmese boys and men, easy-going and full of laughter, smoked cheroots and lounged in shaded corners, trading stories over bowls of steaming rice. And as I walked through it all, I felt a sudden visceral hatred, not toward them, but toward the machine. The inevitable crushing force of empire, rolling forward like a juggernaut, trampling over weaker nations, ripping apart their customs, their homes, their way of life, and replacing it all with something colder, harsher, efficient, soulless and alien. I knew the truth. Burma was doomed. It was a prize, one that would either fall into our hands or into those of the French. This was before the days of the Entente, remember, and nothing but the certainty of its fate, that it must be taken before another power seized it first, could have driven me to do what I was about to do. I wasn't here to stop the fall of a kingdom. I was here to hasten it. I was lost in thought, my mind tangled with too many possibilities, when a sudden uproar shattered my focus. The noise came from the road ahead, loud, chaotic, charged. I pressed forward, elbowing my way through the throng, my heavy riding boots giving me just enough weight to carve a path. Within moments, I broke through to the inner circle of the spectacle. And what a spectacle it was. Typical, cruel, absurd. The Burmese could be as easygoing as pigeons, harmless so long as they were entertained. But this wasn't just amusement. Laughter mixed with scorn, jokes sharpened into jeers, the kind of humour that could turn ugly fast. Whatever was happening at the centre of this mob of men, women and boys, it wasn't just sport. It was something meaner, angrier, dangerous. At the centre of the human ring, three figures commanded the crowd's attention, but only one truly held the stage. He was huge, towering over the others, a thick wooden stick gripped tightly in one hand. His blue cotton lungi, the Burmese long kilt, was hitched up and tied at the waist, giving him the freedom to move. His long black hair had come undone, spilling over his shoulders like a cloak, wild and unkempt. Beneath him, cowering in the dirt, was a Madrasi, a man from southern India, thin, desperate and utterly defenceless. The giant's voice boomed over the crowd, every word punctuated with a brutal strike. The stick cracked against flesh, head, face, arms, body, without mercy, without hesitation. The mob brawled, part amusement, part bloodlust. And the beating continued. The third figure of the group was a Burmese girl of about 15 years of age, who stood there a perfect picture of shame and fear.
"Get up, big man.
Shouted the great Burman.
Get up. I've been looking for you 3 months past. You would rub soot in my face, would you? Better my daughter had died 1,000 times than become the wife of such a thing as you, you black slug. Oh, was there ever such disgrace put upon a respectable oil merchant? But for the wicked ways of good light, I will fill you with kerosene and set you on fire. Get up."
By now, the wretched man at the centre of it all was choking, gasping, barely conscious. The crowd was enjoying the show, but I decided it had gone far enough. I stepped forward and grabbed the Burman's arm, feeling the tension in his muscles as he prepared for another blow. "A million regrets," I said smoothly, my voice laced with mock deference. I hate to interrupt such a righteous punishment, but unfortunately, this one, I drove my boot into the Madrasi's ribs for effect, is wanted in Rangoon on a charge of theft. He's due on the midday steamer, and my orders are clear. I would be eternally grateful if you could postpone killing him until after he's served his sentence. Before anyone could object, I seized the Indian by his scalp lock, yanking him to his feet. He screamed as I dragged him through the press of bodies, the mob instinctively closing around us. To them, I was just a police officer reclaiming a British subject, nothing more. And just like that, their interest vanished. The bloodthirsty throng dissolved, shifting back to their business as if nothing had happened. I leaned down, still cursing and kicking the poor devil to keep up appearances, and muttered in Tamil, "Run for the shore like Shaitan himself is at your heels. There's a steamer leaving. Nah." The Madrasi didn't hesitate. He was gone in a flash, and I was left standing in the aftermath of the storm I had just calmed. He simply said,
"For your honour's soul I shall ever pray,"
and was gone, vanishing into the crowd like a ghost. I wouldn't have mentioned this incident except for what came next. The girl from the bazaar, the one whose furious father had humiliated her in public, had a routine. Every night she carried lamp oil to the palace guard room. Nothing unusual about that. But here's where things took a turn. One of the palace guards happened to be married to the Queen's mother's hairdresser, and in a chain reaction of whispered gossip, the story of her husband's miraculous rescue at the hands of the Farkim with the boots, as she called me, travelled from the girl to the guard, from the guard to his wife, and from his wife straight to the Queen's mother, and then it reached Supayala herself. By the time Kula and I arrived at the War Minister's house, I had no idea the Queen already knew my name. While I waited outside, Kula went in to perform his duty, massaging the great man as if the fate of kingdoms wasn't shifting with every quiet word spoken behind those walls. The Burmans swear by massage, not the delicate, relaxing kind, but something more akin to military discipline. It often started with a child walking up and down the patient's back before the real work began, a proper thrashing from the master himself. While I waited on a woven mat in the outer veranda, 3 young women from the minister's household appeared, their intent clear, to entertain the guest. One of them, a graceful girl with a knowing smile, was smoking a sila, a mild white cheroot nearly a foot long. She took a deep drag and then, in an unmistakable gesture of friendship, offered it to me to share. The second girl brought tea, piping hot and served in tiny blue cups, delicate enough to shatter in the wrong hands. The third girl, however, had her own idea of hospitality. She set to work rigging up the family dulcimer between the veranda posts. This was no dainty little European instrument, the kind that might entertain Her Royal Highness the Princess of Wales. This thing was a beast. 3 yards of solid wood, its bass notes booming like a church bell, tolling the Angelus, its treble clinking sharp as a blacksmith's hammer striking metal. She played the same tune over and over, hammering the keys with growing speed and precision, her movements turning the performance into a breathtaking, fevered rhythm. By the time she was done, I knew every note by heart. She was in the midst of the melody when the statues swung back and the fiercest and most terrible man in Burma appeared on the veranda. It did not take me a moment to understand why the Queen had chosen MUONG SHWAY to aid her in the coup d'etat, which set Thibault on his throne. The man's face was as quiet, inexpressible and merciless as fate. The sort of face that would not change a line if the muzzles of 10 loaded rifles were pointed at it within arm's length, as ready to suffer death as to inflict it. He stood an instant regarding me with eyes which met my own, point to point, and look to look. I confessed to an effort on my part not to look somewhere away from those overpowering orbs, but luckily proved equal to the occasion. I stood up and gave him a double salam, Indian fashion. He was worth it. The girls flew out of the way like ghosts, and we were alone. There was no needless chatter, no verbose pleasantries in the manners of a Burmese gentleman. MUONG SHWAY didn't waste words.
Sit!
He suited action to command, lowering himself onto a plain mat, while gesturing for me to take a more ornate one, a subtle but deliberate statement of status. Still, he said nothing. Instead, he reached for his tobacco holdall, a lacquered box with inlaid designs, and slid it across the space between us. I flipped it open. Inside, everything was neatly arranged. Spice, chewing nut, white lime leaf and cheroots. A complete gentleman's smoking kit. I chose the longest cheroot, lit it, and drew deep, filling my lungs with a thick white cloud of smoke. Then, as etiquette dictated, I handed it over. MUONG SHWAY inhaled slowly, exhaling in silence. A few minutes passed. He watched me, unreadable. I waited, then, finally, he spoke.
Speak!
I didn't waste time. Straight to the point. I told him about the book, how it laid out the advantages of the French railway and steamer scheme, and why I needed an audience with the Queen to present the photographs, explain the details, and make my case. MUONG SHWAY listened in silence, his expression unreadable. Not a flicker of emotion, not a single wasted movement. Then, when I'd finished, he spoke. And in 5 minutes he told me more than I could have learned elsewhere in a week.
You've come at a bad time.
MUONG SHWAY's voice was calm, but his words carried weight.
The king has taken 2 new queens. One he adores. She sings, plays cards, keeps him entertained. He spends his days with her. The other? She's barely more than a child, and he treats her as one, his plaything. Supayalat hates them both.
The words hung in the air, heavy with certainty.
They will die.
No speculation, no hesitation. A simple fact.
Her Majesty is preoccupied with this problem.
Then he leaned in slightly.
There is another matter. The Indian government has warned the king. No more British trade steamers are to be seized on the Irrawaddy. And the king has complied. He has ordered the seizures to stop. The Supayalat hates the Indian government, the steamers and the company, and submission to the decree rankles in her bosom like a hot thorn. Then there's the matter of the prisoners.
MUONG SHWAY's tone darkened.
The ones still alive. Those who hadn't yet met the executioner's blade had friends outside. People desperate enough to petition the Indian government for intervention. The Queen knows it.
And that was the problem.
She understands that wiping out the rest would give the English the perfect excuse to interfere. She wants them dead. But she also knows what it would cost her.
He exhaled slowly, as if weighing the weight of his own words.
The idea that these claimants still breathe, not because she allows it, but because the Indian government might hold her accountable.
He shook his head.
It's almost more than Her Majesty can bear.
There won't be trouble, as long as the steamers keep moving and the executions stay halted. Maung Mia's gaze was steady, but there was no comfort in his words.
But that decision rests with the Queen,
A pause.
and her soul is burning.
He exhaled, as if the weight of the situation was pressing on him too.
So I tell you again, you've come at a bad time.
It hit me immediately. Maung Mia wasn't telling me all this by accident. Every word, every revelation was deliberate. And that raised the real question. Why? Why hand me information that, if I chose, could be used against his own government? Why give me the means to push Burma and the British into direct conflict? There was only one answer. Maung Mia wanted that collision. For reasons of his own, he was prepared to fan the flames between the palace and Simla to set events in motion that neither side could stop. And, as I'd soon find out, that was exactly his plan. Had I known then that the regalia, valued at $250,000, and the hereditary jewels, worth nearly double that sum, were to completely disappear on the day of our entry into Mandalay, I might have held the key to the situation insofar as he was concerned. But as it was, I could only thank him for the excellent advice given and leave the ulterior reasons to take care of themselves. That he was speaking the truth I did not doubt for an instant, because it would have been easy enough, though slower, for me to have gathered it piecemeal from my numerous acquaintances, male and female, who had access to the palace. I thank you, I said, for your information and advice, but with permission I would still see the Queen if I could. I studied his face a little too closely, perhaps, searching for a flicker of reaction, some sign of approval or disapproval. I found nothing. His expression remained unreadable, as impenetrable as old teak wood. His mahogany dark skin, burned even deeper than the usual Burmese hue, bore the marks of 50 years of war, bloodshed, and the relentless fury of the sun. If this was a game of strategy, Maung Mia wasn't giving away his next move.
You must please yourself.
He said, and gave a short, sharp bark over his shoulder. Instantly the hanging screen parted and the eldest girl appeared.
My umbrella and sandals? I shall not eat at home again today. Go!
In a minute more we were on the road to the west entrance to the palace. The crowd parted right and left with a scuttling alacrity, which showed my companion was not only known, but respected. The babel of voices at the gate ceased as we appeared, and everyone, guards and all, squatted on their heels as Maung Mia stalked through into the blockhouse enclosure which guards that entrance to the royal garden. The gate slammed shut behind me with a resounding crash, a final, unmistakable sound. No turning back now. For better or worse, I was committed to the course I'd chosen. Maung Mia said nothing, and neither did I. We crossed the bridge in silence, heading toward the scarlet and gold doorway of the west wing, up a narrow flight of steps, onto the terrace. And there, in a dazzling explosion of colour, the scene unfolded before me. More than 100 women, draped in silks and muslins, stood, sat, or lounged in front of the palace, their garments shimmering in every shade of the rainbow. Their hair and throats adorned with fragrant flowers, they moved with an effortless grace, their laughter and whispers drifting through the air. Behind them, the palace itself loomed, its golden facade ablaze in the sunlight. A wedding cake fit for a god, massive, opulent and streaked with blood. The largest wooden structure in the world, and it looked it. In Burma, it was considered bad manners to stare at strangers. That didn't mean I wasn't being watched. I knew I was a curiosity, just as Maung Mia was a figure of fear, but no one dared to meet my gaze directly, not openly. We moved through the maze of buildings, turning sharply right, then left, weaving between a dozen smaller structures until the space finally opened up before us. A broad grassy lawn stretched ahead, and beyond it, the heart of Mandalay's power. The palace rose in layered tiers, each roof piled upon the next, rising higher and higher until it reached its peak, the never-silent T, an enormous metal spire shaped like an inverted umbrella, hung with bells that never stopped ringing in the wind. This was it, the centre of the universe. I'd read once about a South Sea kinglet whose entire court, secretariat and bodyguard were composed exclusively of women. But I had never imagined seeing anything like this, especially in a civilised court. The Burmese palace was overflowing with femininity. Young women swarmed the grounds, constantly coming and going, yet seemingly doing nothing at all. I had heard, though I couldn't say if it was true, that the palace housed 700 women. That didn't even include the countless others who moved in and out from the city daily. At last, we reached the inner railing of the lawn. Mang Maya stopped.
Stay here.
He said.
I will go in and speak to the Supayalat.
And that's when it happened. My heart sank, a slow, steady drop into my boots. For all my bravado and calculations, the truth remained. I was no hero, and I never would be. A series of grim images flashed through my mind. The impalements, the crucifixions, the royal princes and princesses, their bodies now drifting in the lower reaches of the Irrawaddy, their crime, being born to the wrong bloodline. The Scottish engineer who had walked into this palace 3 months ago and was never seen again. The murdered stokers aboard the Shan, men who had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. And just yards from where I stood, the doomed prisoners, awaiting execution for no reason at all, except that they had once slept on the wrong mats in the wrong corridors, under the wrong roof. Then there was Mang Mia, his iron-eyed, unreadable face, his relentless calculations. He had just left to negotiate on my behalf, or perhaps for his own ends. And the Supayalat, a woman for whom life and death were trivial matters, who could snuff me out with less thought than she would give to a beetle in her path. I was here under false pretences, carrying a French book I could barely read, pretending to represent a company that, if asked, would disown me with pleasure. And quite rightly. At last, when the sweat had soaked through every stitch I had on, I was brought to a sickening sense of my position by the appearance of a captain of the King's Guard and 10 soldiers, who came round the corner of the Queen's quarters and headed straight for me. I muttered a prayer and waited for them. The leader said briefly and emphatically,
"Come."
I stayed a moment out of bravado to wipe my face and give an extra twirl to my moustache before I obeyed. Then I advanced towards my fate. We clanked across the inner yard, and the captain opened a door.
"In here."
He said. Then the door was shut, and the bolts shot home. I was in for it. I will not oppress you with further details of my feelings during that eternal night. My one consolation was that I was not married and that my mother was dead. Apparently there was no immediate wish to treat me ill. I was given a tub and towels, a large mat, tobacco, and later on, curried fish, rice, fruit, and brandy. I woke in the grey stillness of morning. After bathing and dressing, I did the only thing I could. I waited. By high noon, the door swung open and the captain of the bodyguard stepped inside. The first thing I noticed was that he wasn't a Burman. He was a half-caste Indo-European, dressed in native Burmese attire. And from the way he looked at me, it was clear. He had taken an instant dislike to me. His manner was truculent, overbearing. The kind of thinly veiled aggression that comes from a man who believes himself to have the upper hand. He wasn't subtle about it either. Thinking perhaps that I was in no position to resist, he dispensed with all courtesy, something no Burman of high standing would ever do. He even went so far as to lay his hand on my shoulder. That was a mistake. The English in India do not tolerate being manhandled, especially not by Eurasians who fancy themselves powerful. A slow, burning rage rose inside me as I turned to face him. "Unhand me, Janwa," I hissed. The word Janwa meant beast, and the venom in my voice must have struck home. His hand fell away, and for a split second his fingers twitched toward the hilt of his dart, a broad Burmese fighting knife. Then, regaining his composure, the bodyguard sneered, his lips curling back just enough to show his yellowed teeth.
"A rat was caught in a gin.
He said slowly, savouring the words.
I will frighten it with my teeth."
A thinly veiled threat, he saw me as nothing more than a trapped animal, powerless at his mercy. I let the insult settle for a beat, then met his gaze without flinching. "Maybe," I said, voice even, "but the trap was set by its owner. And a gin only costs 4 annas, cheap, replaceable." That stopped him cold. His eyes flickered just for a second before his face hardened again. He hadn't expected pushback, and certainly not a dismissal of his importance. The message was clear. He was no hunter, no predator, just another tool, bought and sold like a cheap trap, easily discarded. His fingers twitched toward his dar, and for a moment I thought he might actually test his luck. But he didn't. Instead, he snarled something under his breath and stepped back, his grip tightening on the hilt of his blade, as if to reassure himself. I had just made an enemy, one who wouldn't forget this slight. We marched along the alleyway to the place where the Queen usually spent the heat of the day, and thence into the Lion Throne Room. Out of all custom and precedence, the place was crowded, although the King was not there. A silence fell over the court as I was led in, and the throng parted right and left as I was officiously pushed by my jailer into the centre of the room. Then, as if by preconcerted signal, the whole crowd of men and women sat down on the floor, and I was left standing alone in the centre, facing the throne of Burma. Below it was a vermilion lacquered chair, traced with gold filigree work and studded with bright stones. Upon this sat a woman. She sat in the European fashion, knees and ankles close together and feet on the ground. Her hands, which were pale saffron colour, each held an arm of the chair. She was dressed in the split skirt of Burma, which in walking shows the inside of the left leg, but in the sitting posture remains slightly overlapping and completely covering the limbs. The colouring of her dress was crimson, yellow and green, encrusted with gold thread. On her body, from the waist up, she wore a flowered muslin short jacket, which fastened with one jewel on the shoulder and hung without further ornament down to and outside of the skirt. Round her neck was the inevitable silk scarf or stole. Bright corn green and 12 feet long, it hung over her breast to the ground on both sides like a green sunbeam, the fierce glare from the outside darting a pencil of light upon her through some small windows high overhead. Her jet black hair was piled high, coiled layer upon layer, rising nearly 8 inches above her head. An intricate, deliberate crown of control and precision. At its centre, a massive flat gold comb held it in place, gleaming under the light. Halfway up, a delicate coronet of jasmine flowers, their petals laced with silver thread, softened the structure. A contrast of beauty and power, elegance and command. For a moment, I stood frozen, my eyes adjusting from the blinding sunlight outside to the dim, gilded chamber before me. Then, in an instant, I made my move. No hesitation, no second guessing. I stepped forward, squared my stance, snapped my heels together and saluted, staking everything on immediate action. And so, for the first time, I came face to face with the Supayala. The guards reacted instantly, a blur of movement. The captain lunged toward me, ready to seize me, but he never got the chance. The Queen never broke eye contact. From the moment I faced her, she had been watching me, assessing me. Then, with a single deliberate motion, she clapped her hands once and pointed to the door.
"Outside you! Let the cooler remain."
The effect was immediate. The captain and his men withdrew without another word. But as they left, I caught the movement of the Eurasian bodyguard, the one I crossed earlier. He positioned himself just outside, standing on the coping of the platform, his Snider rifle levelled directly at me, point-blank range. At one signal from the Queen, he could drill a bullet through my skull without so much as grazing the courtiers seated around me. A silent warning. I was alone. And every move I made now mattered. I stood before the woman who had carved her path to the throne through a blood-stained trail and waited. She said nothing, neither did I. Instead, I studied her, trying to untangle my own reaction. Admiration, fear, both, neither. There was no denying that opinions on the Middle Queen were divided. To some, she was a legend, beautiful, intoxicating, dangerously intelligent. A woman of iron will and ruthless ambition who had seized power with cunning and raw audacity. To others, she was a monster, cold, cruel, calculating, her features harsh, her temper worse. Not a ruler, but a predator. The Burmese and a handful of Europeans swore she was fascinating. The average white man saw only the woman who had been dragged from her palace in disgrace, a prisoner beside a broken king and a dozen terrified concubines. But they had never seen her like this, standing at the height of her power, her gaze unflinching, her presence filling the room like a cold storm. And as I looked into her unyielding eyes, I realised something unsettling. I still didn't know which version of her was true, or if both were. As nearly as one can describe her in writing, she was about 5 feet 3 inches in height, straight and stiffly built, with a substantial waist like old Burmese women, a softly rounded throat and shoulders, small feet and hands, and a wealth of beautiful hair. But not in these lay her beauty, mediocrity, or ugliness, which you will. It was in the broad, low forehead, the high Mongolian cheekbones, the large, firm, full-lipped mouth and strong white teeth, the jaw which closed with the strength of a tiger trap, and the eyes. They were eyes which showed no white, which gleamed black and sombre, or glowed dull red and changed to indigo, which seemed now to meet and form one omniscient, piercing eye, the now to divide into 2 deep, black, half-closed slits over which the long, dense lashes cast a curtain that only half-closed slits all of the woman within. During the silence which followed the withdrawing of the guards, the Queen sat like a graven image looking at me. Then she suddenly spoke in a soft, purring voice, which, however, was perfectly audible all over the room.
By what right did you seize a man in the city yesterday,
She said,
with violence, and then send him, hot foot, to the steamer that left Mandalay at sundown?
For the life of me, I couldn't decide what answer would keep me alive. The truth? That I had stepped in because the man was being brutally beaten by someone twice his size. If I said that, the Queen, and everyone else in the room, would see me as a naive, meddling fool who had no business interfering. Worse, I'd likely end up beaten to a pulp myself and chased into the Irrawaddy by an angry mob. Or I could claim that the man was a British subject and it was my duty to my government to ensure he was treated fairly. That would be an even graver mistake. The Queen would make an example of me, painfully, publicly. A reminder that in this kingdom, it was far better to be a live Burman than a British subject reduced to a pile of charred bones. So, I lied. Smoothly. Convincingly. For the sake of the poor girl, I said, who was horror-stricken at the imminent death of her husband. For a single glaring second, those onyx eyes burned red with anger. Then the Queen laughed. A soft, seductive quiet, soft like a woman who is being caressed by a hand she loves.
Oh,
She murmured.
this is good. This is going to be most amusing. So amusing that I cannot share it with anyone else. Go, my friends. Go and eat cow sway or drink tea or sleep.
And, she added, and her voice changed to the imperative mood, with a knife in every syllable.
Only go, and go right away. And if I see or hear anyone before I will it, I shall be very sad and unhappy tomorrow at sunrise.
The impassive faces of the men and women as they rose and went showed no surprise, no curiosity, no resentment. Such an idea as questioning the absolute right of the Supialat to do with them as she liked never even occurred to them. It was an order that there be a going, and they went, without haste but without lagging.
You too.
She said, turning towards the guards.
And Diaz,
She added.
Diaz, you villain, come here.
The Eurasian came slowly forward to where I stood, and the white Portuguese blood in him made it impossible for him to hide the hatred and the jealousy in his heart.
Diaz, go and stand in the sun outside the king's sleeping chamber and send Makin to me if he leaves his room. Well, what are you standing there for?
I almost admired the man's fortitude in risking her displeasure thus. It was the drop of white blood in him again, which made him question for a moment her steel-shod authority
I wish to tell your majesty that I have not searched this man's clothing for firearms.
Unnecessary zeal, Diaz. The English are not like some peoples, who would murder a woman in cold blood for political considerations. But I will excuse you this once. Now go.
She gave him scarcely more than a glance, but he went white to the teeth. This was the greatest attempt at questioning her command that I was ever to witness, save one. As he went, he gave me a look which spelt murder, if ever I've seen it, and I wager I have. I was up against something bigger than a jealous Portuguese half-caste, however, and I very soon knew it.
Have you ever seen the inside of a prison before today?
She asked. No, I replied. I have not,
Well,
she said.
if you tell any more lies, you will. You can sit. I want your attention, and you have stood long enough. Why did you arrest that man in the bazaar yesterday?
Because he was being beaten to death.
Is that the truth?
Your Majesty has warned me. It is the truth.
What a fool you must be. What is that book you have there?
The gift of a French company to the King of Burma.
How did you come by it?
I stole it
Why?
because I wanted to present it myself.
Why?
It was an excuse for gaining an audience with Your Majesty.
To what end?
I wanted to warn Your Majesty of the extreme danger you run if you carry out your intention of putting the remaining princes to death.
Is this warning of yours prompted by self-interest, or such another folly as caused you to interfere on behalf of that dog of a Madrasi yesterday in the bazaar?
She asked. Both, I replied.
Are you in the pay of the Indian government?
No,
What will be the consequence if I get rid of the rest of the prisoners?
it will be regarded as a declaration of war by the English. I knew this was exaggerating the matter, but counted on her ignorance of the exact difference between the Council Board at Simla and the House of Commons in their views of massacres in remote parts of Asia.
Supposing I accept the offer made by the French company, what then? The company, in the end, means the French nation.
It wasn't a question. It was a test. A move in a game where the stakes were empires, not contracts. They will, without consulting you, establish a sort of protectorate over the country, and sooner or later will interfere directly with the Burmese government with startling results, I answered. The Queen's eyes flashed, her voice sharp with mocking indignation.
Ah.
She said, her tone edged with scorn.
So, in either case, it seems that we, are nothing more than a basketball, to be kicked skyward by whichever power finds the excuse to swoop down upon us.
She leaned forward slightly.
You must be either very foolhardy or very ignorant to bring me such an insolent message.
Her words tightened like a snare.
And whether you are an agent, as I suspect, or merely a madman, I will see to it that you do not leave this place with intelligence to sell, to either side.
The room felt smaller, heavier. The warning wasn't just words, it was a sentence. That is for Your Majesty to decide, I replied evenly. But I will say this. If you commit to certain actions, your enemies will come for you. And when they do, they will have all the justification they need. I let the words hang in the air. A warning, a fact, and maybe a challenge. I spoke firmly and in a loud voice, for I wanted to make her angry, but for once she held herself in check and replied with a self-control which belied her reputation.
Can there be any justification at all in meddling with the internal affairs, nay, even the domestic arrangements of the palace? From time immemorial, it has been the recognized custom to remove all possible upstarts from the way to the throne. Any of the king's cousins would poison him if they had the chance. And I stand between him and a crowd of would-be murderers.
To hear this arch-murderess talking about prevention nettled me somewhat, and I replied scornfully, "The old order changes." My voice was steady, deliberate. Kings, far greater than Febor, rulers beside whom he is but a child, have been forced to bow. Nations, powerful enough to swallow Burma whole, have had no choice but to bend to the will of the White Queen. I let the words settle. A statement of fact, a reminder, and perhaps a warning. At the mention of Victoria, The Supayalat started violently and rose from her chair like a hooded cobra.
Oh,
She cried.
has it indeed come to this? That here in my own court, in my own palace, I am to be insulted by a nameless rascal with the mention of that woman. I am sick to death of hearing of her wealth and power, and what she has done, may do, can, will, might, and ought to do. One would think, to hear you talk, that she was someone divine, set far above such trash as me. No, insolent Englishman, that I am no more impressed by the mention of your sovereign than by my lamp trimmer in the compound, and that, if I choose, I will decorate every winged gate in the city wall with the living body of a kula tonight. And when they scream, you will add your own howls to theirs before I have you dragged out at dawn to die in a far slower fashion.
Yes, I answered. Others also will howl first. Then her demoniac temper fairly gave way, and she raved like a madwoman. She tore the golden comb from her hair and the scarf from her neck, flinging them across the room, and the massive folds of her thick tresses swept the floor and wreathed themselves about her body as she swayed before me in a blind passion, hurling at me all the unprintable abuse of the East. I had risen, and we stood facing each other not 3 feet distant while she raged thus. Horrible to see. Intense hatred, jealousy, thwarted ambition, and her unslaked thirst for blood, which she was restrained from shedding by the fear of the race whose self-appointed ambassador I was and whose type I represented, spent itself on my defenceless head as, with a movement like a panther about to spring, she patted the ground with her soft-shod feet and looked up into my face with the eyes of a demon. Never again, I hope, shall I see a woman so transfigured by unreasoning anger as was this fury that I had raised to my undoing. So perverse is man's nature that I almost loved her at that moment. She was so utterly beyond everything feminine I had ever seen that some savage instinct in me went out to her in her abandonment. Suddenly she choked and began clutching and tearing at her throat. The jewel fell to the floor, rolled into the river of light from overhead, and lay there flaming in the beam which struck full on it. Her pale brown fingers shredded the muslin of her dress and bared her bosom as she tottered and would have fallen. Quick as thought, my arms were round her, pinioning her own and supporting her quivering body, while she, forgetting all else than that she was seized by one she supposed to be her enemy, threw back her head and opened her lips for a shriek which would have brought the palace about my ears and meant instant death. Then I did a thing which no man, living or dead, has ever done or will do again. I kissed the Queen of Burma full on the mouth. "Peace, little one," I said gently. "There is no need to call," and I released her. She sank back into the vermilion chair and gasped.
Give me water.
A filter of 3 earthen pots, one above the other in a wooden rack, stood at the end of the room. I brought a china bowl of water and gave it to her.
Pick up my comb.
She commanded. I picked up the comb and gave her that also. Rapidly and with marvellous cunning, she coiled up her hair and thrust her comb into it. Then she said, simply,
I am glad you prevented me from calling. It is not fitting for my people to find me in such a humiliating position. And because you have rendered me that service, and because you are a man and not a monk, your death shall be as easy as I can well make it.
She slipped her sandal and struck a soft blow on the gong at her side, and immediately a woman appeared.
Send Diaz to me.
She ordered, then to me.
Why did you do that? That which you did when I was going to scream. We do not do that here.
It is a custom, I replied. It is a sign of friendship. She said, and she looked long and steadily at me through the heavy fringed lids of her fathomless black eyes. Then, with what was almost a sigh or a sob, she said,
It is a pity. It is a great pity. But there is nothing else to do. How could there be? Here, Diaz.
For the yellow man had appeared.
This man is to be shot. Shot, mind, not tortured. If I hear so much as a breath that he has been badly treated or that his death was bungled, I will close your left eye for you to ensure better shooting in future. Away with him.
And she yawned deliberately, placing her hands behind her head. I bowed and thanked the Supayalat for her clemency. Then the two men went out, and I saw her no more. The guards marched me out of the palace enclosure, out of the garden, and beyond the western blockhouse. It was Diaz's evident intention to march me through the city and enhance his reputation by parading an Englishman through the bazaar as his prisoner. There was a weird informality in it all. The moment we cleared the palace gate, the tension shifted, just enough. Without a word, we all reached for our cheroots, the ritual of smoking signalling a return to something almost normal. One of the soldiers stepped closer, holding out his cheroot.
Light it,
He said. A simple gesture, or maybe a test. I took it, struck a flame and inhaled deep, never breaking eye contact as I passed it back. They were armed with Snyders and carried the heavy papered cartridges in black leather boxes strapped over the back. Diaz's weakness for swagger was his downfall. We had barely passed Mang Maya's house when I heard it, a sharp exclamation.
Oh dear.
A girl, clutching two long wooden hammers, vanished in a flash behind the hanging curtain and into the house. I didn't have time to dwell on it. 5 minutes later, as we neared the western wall, the place where my delusions of empire building were about to end abruptly, a sound cut through the thick air, the rapid hoofbeats of a Burmese trotting pony. Instinct took over. We whirled around, just in time to see Moong Mia himself riding straight for us, and I knew, whatever came next, it wouldn't be good.
Halt there. What is going on?
I did not give Diaz time to answer. I wanted to get speech of the old man myself before he lost interest in me. A dead man is not such an important person here as he is in London. I die by the Queen's order, I said.
How?
He asked, he did not say when. There was no delay and humbugging about with a condemned man in Burma. That also is different from London. By shooting, I answered.
Good.
Said Moong Maya, and the faintest suspicion of a smile showed in his face as he turned to Diaz.
I am going to take your men and bring 3 other miscreants for their deserts.
He said.
You will then shoot all 4 when I return. Until then, you will remain with this prisoner and guard him. As he is unarmed, I need not leave anyone with you. I take it you are able to take care of a naked man?
Diaz flushed angrily.
Yes, Thakin. I can take care of him and 20 other English dogs like him.
Good,
said the chief, the single word clipped and decisive. It wasn't approval, it was acknowledgement, and that made all the difference.
Come, my children. It is getting late and will be sundown before we are back. See that you guard him well, Diaz.
He did not look at me again, and that was the last I ever saw of Mang Mia. I knew enough of him to know that he would not concern himself with such trivialities as arrests and summary executions unless they had some political significance, and I guessed that this was the old fire-eater's way of giving me my fighting chance. If I got away, he could claim a share in my escape. If I did not, it was no concern of his, and one man more or less in his history was not a thing to be taken seriously. A rest tent stood pitched just outside the west gate between the moat and the wall, and into this Diaz drove me with as much noise and abuse as he could raise, so as to attract attention from the country folk crossing the bridge into the city. I submitted meekly, and sitting down on the ground, buried my face in my hands. I was torn by many conflicting emotions. The first consideration was that I must escape, but Diaz squatted with his rifle across his knee and the muzzle pointing at the pit of my stomach, so that for the present it was a hazard to rush him, and, moreover, it was too light. Like Wellington at Waterloo, I prayed for darkness. I knew Moong Mia would keep his men in place until late, giving me just enough time to slip away. I needed 30 minutes, half an hour to sunset, half an hour to freedom, or failure. And I was nothing if not practical. So I conserved my strength, lying flat on my back on the charpoy, steadying my breath, forcing my body to relax before the storm came. Because when the time came to run, I would need everything I had. The charpoy was a simple thing. A wooden frame, low to the ground, its surface woven tight with coarse jute rope, stretched just enough to keep a man off the hard-packed earth. It had no luxury, no comfort, only practicality. The ropes creaked slightly as I lay back, their rough texture pressing against my spine. The air beneath it was cooler than the sweltering heat above, making it a favoured resting place for men used to long, brutal days. A soldier's bed, a prisoner's bed, a fugitive's bed. But for now, it was mine. And as I stared up at the sky, waiting for the last light to fade, I let the charpoy cradle my exhaustion, knowing the next time I lay down, it might not be on anything at all. In the many trying corners I have been in, I have always had the blessed gift of sleep, and during this hour of waiting I slept, although I never actually lost touch with myself and my surroundings. When I awoke, it was pitch dark. I sat up suddenly with every hair bristling, every sense as keen as a razor, every muscle set for immediate action. I listened intently for a moment, and then went nearly demented with joy, for the sound which met my ears was sweeter at that moment than the song of the nightingale. It was the deep, resonant, hog-like snore and snort of a man plunged 7 fathom deep in slumber. I slipped off my boots and thanked heaven my feet were hard and tough with long weeks spent in the sandals and barefoot fashion of the country. Diaz's rifle lay on the ground beside him. I drew it quietly towards me and, feeling for a soft, damp place in the bank of the moat, drove the muzzle deep into the thick clay. Then, pulling it out, I wiped it clean with my handkerchief, opened the breech to make certain it was loaded, and tiptoeing back laid it quietly beside the sleeping man. Next minute I was away and back through the gate into the city, and heading by an obscure lane for Cooler's ass. The good man was impassively hospitable and offered me food. "Not now," I said. "There is a hurry. Give me the run of your medicine chest for 5 minutes, a razor, an old lungi and jacket. I've got a big silk handkerchief and I don't want boots. Only, be quick. The sooner I'm out of your house, the better." He showed me into his inner room. He had no women. I had my moustache off in an instant. Then I emptied a couple of ounces of pomegranate of potash into a basin, and having darkened the waters to deepest claret colour, ducked my head and shoulders in the fluid. My arms and legs and chest being all stained brown, I let them dry in the intense heat of the room, while I twisted my long red silk handkerchief round my head, in the fashion of a Burmese man-at-arms, tying the bow tight on the forehead. It did not take me a minute to jump into the lungye and jacket, and the next thing Cooler knew was that a sprightly young Mandalay buck was taking a long pull at his water jar outside the house door. I bade him farewell, and then, running down the street, turned into the main road and plunged into the throng. The fitful light of the fat lamps and naphtha flares filled the bazaar with bright blotches and dark moving shadows. I pressed through the crowd onward to the palace gate, passing unnoticed in that seething mass of humanity. The shop of the oil merchant was full of customers, and my girlfriend of yesterday handed me an anna's worth of paraffin as I leant forward and said, "The man who saved your husband yesterday bids you go now to the palace and tell the guard that the white man has escaped, gone down to the river, and on board the steamer which leaves tomorrow. If you have anything to be grateful for, do this at once." I did not wait for an answer, but went straight to the bamboo plantation opposite the guardroom and waited. The girl was true to her friend. I saw her speaking excitedly to the guards, and next instant I heard the big gong inside thundering out the assembly. What happened in the palace during the next half hour I do not know, but I learned later that the Queen ordered the immediate capture of the steamer, the imprisonment of its captain, and my head to be brought to her. What I actually saw was the stream of armed men marching down the main street, followed by a mob some thousands strong, all heading for the shore. I joined the crowd, and the march to the river began. Close to me was one of many men on horseback, his wiry pony fitted with red rope reins and bridle, and a saddle like a red pulpit cushion. I offered him 10 rupees for the loan of his pony, promising to return the beast back to Mang Mia's house by sunrise. He slipped out of the saddle, and I was up in his place at once. There was no getting clear of the throng until we reached the next turn. Then I trotted down a side street and reached the southernmost gate in the west wall, which is the nearest point to the shore from the fort. Once outside the city, I let the pony have it, and we flew through the gloom at a spanking pace. My mount reached the shore with heaving flanks and wagging tail, and I fell from the saddle on all fours. I was along the wharf and up the gangplank like a burnt cat, and before the sleepy-headed Dutchman on watch knew I was on board, I was hammering at the cabin skylight like an undertaker working overtime. The hatchway opened, and the head of the skipper appeared. When he became aware that a Burman was beating the devil's tattoo over his cuddy skylight, he made use of just the sort of refreshing and well-chosen remarks for which the English mercantile marine is so justly noted. He had got as far as
"Swizzle-eyed, ring-tailed son of a Burmese son,"
when I interrupted him. "Burmese be hanged," I shouted, rudely. "I'm a Cockney. The mob are coming to gut your rotten old dugout and lob you in the farthest corner of the clink. They'll be here in 5 minutes. Listen." A dull, ugly roar from the eastward showed that the crowd was working itself up for the final rush as it came. It was hopeless to think of saving the vessel, and the skipper knew it.
"Lay off the watch."
He roared. I waited for no more. Casting her painter adrift, I dropped into the stern of the ship's dinghy and scrambled forward, shipping the rowlocks as I went. The skipper came last. We were 7 all told. "Captain," I said, "if ever your men pulled in their lives, they should pull now. The palace guard is ahead of the mob with rifles, and the Supayalat has ordered your body, dead or alive, to be brought to the palace." The fringe of grey whiskers bristled out round the red face as he replied,
"I'm obliged to you, sir, for your timely warning and advice, but we'll pay them out for this."
Then, with a roar, the mob burst upon the doomed vessel. A human deluge swept along the deck and flooded into the cabins and hold, while screams, howlings, crashing and resounding blows told that the cargo was being broached and looted. A figure appeared on the bridge, gazing wildly riverward in the glare of the torches.
"There they are.
It shrieked.
There. He has escaped."
It was Diaz. The target he made was too tempting for the skipper, and he raised his pistol. "Stop," I said. "Let him take his chance. What is one among so many?" Then Diaz raised his rifle and, aiming full at me, pulled the trigger. There was a blinding flash and a ripping report as the clay plug breech blew up in his face, and losing his balance he pitched forward into the racing millstream and sank. The Queen's temper had done exactly what I had counted on. It had sealed her fate. The loss of that steamer was, as a military friend of mine once put it, the last straw that gave the Indian camel the hump.
After the British takeover, Queen Supayalat was placed under house arrest, her once formidable influence confined but her spirit unbroken. Her cohorts either joined the colonial forces or melted away into the populace, their tales of valour fading into legend. As the British implemented their rule, the stories of Queen Supayalat's defiance inspired future generations. Though she spent her last days in solitude, her legacy endured as a symbol of resistance and hope for her people. Queen Supayalat's spirit, a beacon of unyielding resistance, ensured that the heart of her nation remained unconquered, inspiring continuous struggle for freedom and self-determination.